Hi Printed Book. I wanted to recap how to make the piano hinge book. So this is pretty simple in terms of materials. It's just paper folded and cut, and then it's held together with these bamboo skewers, the same you would use for like barbecue. But you can use a lot of different things for the rods. I've seen people use the paper sticks like for candy. You may be able to construct your own just by rolling paper up, or toothpicks, metal, etc. There's a lot of different things you could use for the rods if you don't have those specific ones. And it makes this really pretty pattern on the outside just by alternating the hinge. And I do think it's nice that it lays pretty flat when it's open. So this book's got a lot of different options. And it doesn't take a whole lot to put it together. So what I've got here are just a stack of folios. You do need that gutter, so it's got to be folded at least on the hinging edge so you can slide the rods in. And then I made a jig. My jig is the same height as my folios, and I just evenly dispersed some lines about an inch apart along the long edge, so these horizontal lines here. And then you need to figure out how thick the rod is that you're going to use for the hinge. And that took some trial and error for me, but it ended up being about 1/4 of an inch. You don't want this slit to be so wide that the rod will slide out later, and it has to be wide enough to accommodate the rod. So you kind of have to make some dummies to see how wide those slits need to be. But essentially what I did was mark out my slits horizontally, just evenly disperse them, as many as you want. And then I made another mark over that was the thickness of my rod. So mine, like I said, ended up being 1/4 of an inch. And then from that thickness, you just make these small little V's, very thin little cutouts, and that's going to give you some room when you're sliding the rod in there, and just keep the pages from knocking into each other. So they could actually be a little bit thinner. I think mine are kind of sloppy. So try and cut those V's, as thin as possible. And then you're going to use your jig, and I line mine up along the folded edge of a folio, so along the spine. And then I tape mine just with like a slightly sticky tape so that I can hold the jig in place while I'm cutting. And then remember, the foredge should be on the opposite side. So then you can go back and cut your hinges. And I am cutting, just using my jig as my guide, I am cutting through both thicknesses of that folded folio and just removing those little tick marks from the spine side. Okay, and you would do that same, using the same jig. You would do that for all of your folios, and I've got mine prepped here. And then after you cut those little tick marks away, I like to make a score line that same thickness that I made the mark on my jig, and that just helps like reinforce where they're going to get folded later. So for me, that was 1/4 of an inch, but you're just making that score right at the points of your triangles. And I do make that on both sides. So make it on one side, flip it over, make it on the back, and do that for all of your folios. So then I've got one more to do here. After you get your scores, then you want to stack your book up in the order that it's going to be when it's finished. So like page 1, 2, etc. And then you're going to reinforce where those hinges are taking place. So pick them up, and then you want to alternate, bend one set one direction, the other set the opposite, all the way down the spine. And that's just going to help make sure that you're lining up the right hinges when you get ready to put this together. Now for the covers, I'm going to go ahead, I'm using one of these rods that hasn't been cut down because it's still got the pokey side, and that will help me push open that small little hinge there. So you're picking every other one in terms of each section. So I'm going to start inside my second folio, but then in order to link the previous one, I'm going to skip back into the first and then back and forth. So it's one from one folio and one from the other. And again, this rod's not cut down to the right size. I'm just using this one because it has a point to get that hinge opened up and in place before I will insert the one that is the proper size. So there you can see that alternate. And so this first folio ends up being your cover. So you can take your rod out and you can just cut these extra little hinges away, or you can open your folio and just invert those so they'll be hidden inside when you go to put the book together. So just like that. You don't need those extra set because there's no hinge on the other side of a cover. So then you can go ahead and slide your 2 scale rod in. So the rod should be the same height as your folios so that they're not sticking out from the head or the tail of the book. And it does help if you kind of round off that rod on the ends so that it will slide into the hinge a little cleaner without bending the paper. So that's my first rod. And then you would go through and do the same thing that you did for the first one. So use the pointier skewer just to open the hinge up. And again, I'm picking every other hinge from each of the folios. Oops. And once you get these opened and kind of reinforced, then you can go back and put the proper size rod in. So that's how you add each of the folios until you get to the back cover, and then you would want to do the same thing where you remove or hide those extra hinges.